Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review. In today's video I'm going to review Music for Animals by Nils Frahm. Modern classical composer Nils Frahm returns with a massive 3-hour album in where we see him mostly going into directions of ambient and drone, which is something that is not really that much uncommon with Nils Fram's works. Instead, I would actually say that some of my favorites and some of my most preferable works of Nils Frahm are those who contain those elements. As a big fan of electronic music, I find that his ambient and electronic passages, for the most part at least, are done in a really good way, and not that his classical compositions are not great, but in those cases they're a bit of a hit or miss for me. Now obviously having such a massive album over here with such lengthy tracks going for like 13 or like 25 minutes, it's a bit of a risk. It is a really lengthy album and it can obviously just be kinda hard to just sit through all of it, and as you can guess, we're mostly talking about a pretty sleepy and soothing and smooth release. It is an album that is calm, it is relaxing, and it's pretty minimal for the most part. It's just tracks that go into patterns that repeat themselves over and over again for a really long period of time. This can go both ways. For me, it's whether I end up being captivated by the overall ideas to the point where I won't really feel that the runtime would really bother me listening to this whole album. And fortunately, I'd say that what we have with Music for Animals over here is a pretty solid release. One that, yep, it's pretty lengthy, but in my opinion, it is a really nice album when it comes to something like really soothing and relaxing. It is a bit of a more inconsistent album though than what I was expecting when I was getting into this album first, because this album ends up having tracks that fuse elements that you would see in various eras of Nils Fram's music, which on one hand it's beneficial as it sort of keeps the album engaging and sort of refreshing, not just being the same approach over and over again. However, there are certain tracks that in my opinion didn't really feel that much properly executed with this particular album and what it was going for. Now, despite this being a pretty lengthy release, given its minimalism and its simplicity, there is not really that much to say about the album. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward, and if you are familiar with those more ambient approaches of Nils Fram's music, you basically know what you're getting into. You just have a much more extended version over here with an album that goes for like 3 hours long, but it's only 10 tracks over here, so there's not really that much to unpack, and most of the tracks don't really develop that much after a certain point, which, like I said beforehand, if the ideas are nice and they manage to keep me engaged, I don't really care if they're just the same thing over and over again. I mean, the first track, The Dog with 1,000 Faces, it is an extremely minimal track, actually one of the most minimal moments in this entire project, a track that just keeps on with the same pattern, but I believe that it's done and executed in a really beautiful way. I like how soothing and smooth the track is, I like its overall idea, and it's just a pretty simple and effective song that goes for 26 minutes, and I wasn't even bothered by it. The track just passes by pretty nicely, and for me it was a pretty strong introduction. The very next track, Muscle Memory, feels kinda similar. It doesn't really have that much of a more development to it when it comes to its approach or its sound, and I believe that it's a bit of a lesser version than what we got in the first song. Muscle Memory was not one of the most memorable moments for me over here, so I'd say that it was just okay, it was a pretty decent track. Then we have Single Sin. Now this one, I believe that it starts in a sort of blunt note. I wasn't really that much engaged when the track started, but when it comes to the second half, we actually have a transition over here. One that for me made the track much more engaging, much more compelling, and I personally would honestly hope that we would have this idea and sound throughout the entirety of the song, because it feels like it's going on for such a short period of time in this massive song, and I would honestly really like to see this being developed even further, because I really enjoyed the idea out of the second half, but as a whole track, it's just pretty decent. Then we have the first proper change-up in this album with the track Ship in black and white, because in this one we get even more the sense of an electronic song in terms that we're not just really necessarily talking about an ambient song or a drone song, but actually one that has a bit of a subtle beat to it and actually being a little bit more rhythmic. This is like a direction that we would see in releases like Encores 2 and 3, which for me it's a positive since I really enjoyed those particular releases. However, I believe that in the context of this album, this particular approach is not that much beneficial. For me, it actually makes for one of the least interesting moments over here, because I don't really believe that this particular sound is all that fitting for going for like 24 minutes long. This is the one moment where I believe that its whole minimalism didn't really serve that much to its benefit, so for me it was a track that quickly felt kinda forgettable and not that much engaging. For me, the more drony and ambient passages of the previous songs were much more compelling for what the album was going for. Instead, what we get with Ship in black and white is a direction that I don't really see it working that much greatly. With Stepping Stone is where we also see a different approach with this album and a theme that would actually occur with the rest of the project as it would go on, where we would see an even more focus on classical instrumentation. Something that you could say that you could get in parts with some of the previous songs, but with Stepping Stone is possibly the first example where we see it being the most prominent aspect. And for me, just like with Single Scene, it's a track that started somewhat underwhelming, one that didn't really have one of its most engaging ideas, mainly because it felt kinda random. It was going a little bit over the place and it didn't really seem to have a sense of direction to it. But once again, this is something that changes when we get to the second half, where it actually follows a pattern, and this is where the track shines in my opinion. And once again, I would really like just to see this track being this one melody repeating itself over and over again, rather than having this first half where it feels so random and then you have this beautiful composition, this really compelling melody towards the second half. So for me, this is another sort of wasted potential in the sense that, in my opinion, I would prefer this track if it was handled in a bit of a different way. But at least we get a decent track where the second half is at least pretty good. With Briefly, where in my opinion we get the most compelling idea out of this album, this track is executed really nicely, and while it has some of the rhythmic tones and synthy elements that we would get in the track Ship in black and white, in this particular song it's also accompanied with some classical instrumentation playing in the background, having some really nice and subtle free improvised elements throughout. And it's just that the overall idea, the way this track sounds and the vibes that it's creating makes for a really gorgeous moment, which for me, like I said, makes for undoubtedly one of the biggest highlights out of this album, if not the biggest one. Even though it goes for 27 minutes and it's the longest one, I believe that this is the most solid idea from start to finish. Then there's the shortest song called Right, which I'd say certainly feels lackluster in comparison to some other tracks. I mean, the point is for it to be minimal and just pretty simplistic, but I don't know, just for 7 minutes it doesn't really bring all that much to the table in comparison to what we've heard previously. World of Squares is another track that I would consider a highlight, another one of those tracks that seems to give a bigger emphasis on the classical instrumentation side of things, and I believe that it's done and handled in a really nice way over here, to the point where it makes for one of the coolest ideas out of this album. Then I believe that with the Lemon Day is the point where the album just becomes slightly unengaging, with a track that seems to share elements that we've obviously heard before, and it doesn't even make for memorable ideas or melodies over here. And finally there is the mostly classical composition To Dream, a track that has lots of parts that are just complete silence, and it's also easily the most chaotic moment over here. This is one that focuses more on like free improvised elements rather than just keeping with the same pattern, just having something simplistic or minimal to it. It is the one song that goes into many different directions in its runtime. It doesn't really keep up with a specific tone or melody. There is a lot going on to this track, so it makes for a chaotic finisher that I feel slightly indifferent in comparison to some of the more simple and effective moments that we have throughout this whole album. This finisher just feels like an okay idea, at least we get something different and refreshing, but certainly not one of the most memorable or one of my favorite moments in the album. So, Music for Animals is pretty solid in my opinion, actually one of the most solid albums I've heard from Nils Frahm recently, because some of the more recent stuff from Nils Frahm with some of the more classical compositions have been quite hit or miss for me, but with this more electronic and somewhat experimental direction in some cases, I believe that we get some pretty cool results over here. Lengthy album, massive even, but undoubtedly one of the most chill and the most soothing releases that you can find out of this year. I'm gonna give Music for Animals a 7 out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why? And what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.